I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next talk here. We have Ryan Mattke with us from the University of Minnesota Libraries. As I said this morning when we were starting out, the pandemic has actually offered us an opportunity to bring in speakers from a little bit further away. Ryan is one of those folks. Ryan is the map librarian, the head of the Borchert Map Library at the University of Minnesota Libraries. He's been with the libraries for 15 years and head of that library for about 10 years, if I'm doing my math right. I've met Ryan a few times because he is the I think the title is project lead for the Big Ten Academic Alliance Geospatial Data project, which seeks to combine the collecting abilities of the academic Big Ten. I think that's actually an 11 or a 12 right now academically, even though it's only 10 sports teams. And
15 actually.
15, no kidding.
Yes.
Why do they still call it the Big Ten then? A couple 2-3 years ago, he became the project co-director and a co-founder of the Mapping Prejudice project. I think it's especially important today when, for some reason, saying Black Lives Matter is a controversial statement. It's really important that we remind ourselves through both primary source documents, which Ryan works with a lot, as well as secondary explorations of the great efforts and machinations that white America took that showed that Black lives didn't matter. And that's why today's movement is so strong, because mainstream America, or white America, has really tried to show that Black lives don't matter. And people like Ryan and people in the BLM movement are trying to work against basically all of our American history with these efforts. So I'm really pleased to have Ryan here today with us, all the way from the Midwest. And Ryan, I'll just turn it right over to you. I think you've got the ability to share your screen.
There we go. Can you see the screen?
Yes.
All right. Thank you, John, for inviting me, and to the whole Map Society for taking the time to hear this today. I caught the end of the last presentation. This one won't. We're not. That one was showing some very beautiful maps, and this one will be a little heavier, but hopefully not without hope. So there will be time for questions at the end. So save those up or enter them in the chat as we go along, and I'd be happy to answer questions at the end.
And we will be having a short break after Ryan's talk.
Sounds good. So thank you for the introduction. So Mapping Prejudice is a project that is leading community members in the work of constructing interactive digital maps of racial covenants for American communities. So over the course of about the last 3.5 years in Minneapolis and Hennepin County, Minnesota, Mapping Prejudice has developed a process that uses GIS-based data visualization, citizen research, and community conversations to encourage participants to confront structural racism. So the map shows when and how large swaths of land were restricted through racial covenants. And these were things that barred people who were not white from buying or even occupying certain parcels of land. The map invites people to connect past practices with contemporary racial disparities. I'm often asked, why do this in a library? Why not in an academic department or a research center? For me, the answer is that the library is inherently interdisciplinary. It is an intersectional hub that can bring together experts from different departments that are interested in the same topic. The libraries are also experienced in project management and in networking. We're able to leverage our connections in various disciplines in order to really bring people together who are interested in this kind of work. And that's the kind of effort it took to launch and sustain this project. So over the past several years, our team has given many presentations where we share our data and describe the history of housing discrimination in Minneapolis. In these presentations, we often issue a warning. We have said, we in Minneapolis have the highest racial disparities in the country. It is unjust, but it's also unsustainable. and this has the potential to rip our community apart. And then on the evening of May 25th, George Floyd was murdered by Minneapolis police officers. And from this corner of 38th in Chicago, demonstrations and civil unrest spread around the city and around the world. And what has mushroomed into a national and international movement, approximately 25 million Americans have joined public demonstrations for Black Lives Matter. This is the largest protest movement in American history. And over the summer, Mapping Prejudice fielded inquiries from people around the world who wanted to know why this started in Minneapolis. Our team was able to provide one slice of a larger explanation: the history of racial covenants and the willful amnesia around this history of discriminatory housing practices, specifically in Minneapolis in this case. So why this project? One reason is that we wanted to confront what we saw as civic dissonance. Proponents point to our city's fantastic parks, our sophisticated art scenes, our voting rates, and our enthusiasm for volunteering. The problem is that the belief in this miracle masks both past crimes and contemporary inequities. This talk of miracles was ultimately destructive. It eclipsed what the coronavirus pandemic and the murder of George Floyd has made impossible to ignore. Minnesota, in the words of so many of our Black neighbors, is a great place to live if you are white. It is not so nice to be a person of color here. So today, by many measures, the Twin Cities have the highest racial disparities in the country. That means that Black people are way more likely than white residents to suffer poverty, to experience violence, and struggle with chronic illness. They're less likely to graduate from high school. Housing is at the root of these other disparities. Without safe and affordable housing, it is almost impossible to access healthcare or education. You cannot shelter in place. You are more vulnerable to crime. To believe in the miracle of Minneapolis, you have to ignore this inequality. You have to ignore racism, and you have to silence the past. So you have to forget deliberately how we got to the place we are today. But Black people have never had the luxury of forgetting. Mapping Prejudice is calling on everyone to remember. These contemporary racial disparities are not the result of some natural order. Our map illuminates how developers used racial covenants to reserve huge swaths of land for the exclusive use of white people at a very critical moment in the development of the city. So in Minneapolis, this practice started in 1910, when Henry and Lenora Scott sold a property on 35th Avenue South to Nels Anderson, who was a Swedish baker. The home was extremely modest, has a chicken coop out back even, but the deed for this property included this racial restriction that stipulated that the premises shall not at any time be conveyed, mortgaged, or leased to any person or persons of Chinese, Japanese, Moorish, Turkish, Negro, Mongolian, or African blood or descent. The pioneer of this practice, Edmund Walton, led what was called the Seven Oaks Corporation. It was a real estate development company that put this same language into thousands of deeds across the city. I'm reading these deeds that we have found because Mapping Prejudice is focused on calling out racism and naming whiteness. And that's why I want you to hear that what these covenants sound like, even though I know that this language is offensive. Like this one: no persons of any race other than the Aryan race shall use or occupy any building or any lot. This one's from 1946, by the way. Or this one from Ramsey County in 1948, and it reads that the said premises shall be occupied only by persons of the Caucasian race. So we haven't done a comprehensive survey of other counties in Minnesota, but we know that covenants were not just an urban phenomenon. They were used in communities large and small around the whole state of Minnesota. So we have been leading community members in the work of mapping these restrictions, first in Hennepin County and now in neighboring Ramsey County, which is where St. Paul, Minnesota is. We use computer scripts to comb through millions of property records to identify the documents that seem to have racist language, and then we upload these flagged deeds to a crowdsourcing platform, and we invite volunteers to extract the information necessary to put these restrictions on a map. So for Hennepin County, we had 3,000 volunteers who read over 177,000 historical property deeds. And In that process, they found about 24,000 property parcels that have racial covenants, including the couple of covenants that you see here. The one on top I find also interesting. No person of any race other than the Caucasian race shall use or occupy any building or any lot except that it shall not prevent occupancy by domestic servants of a different race. So, but I do want to get to, here's what we've documented so far. So the highlighted part of the map here is Hennepin County. We're kind of on the right side of the east side of the county there is Minneapolis. So what you see here is a conglomeration of blue dots. Each blue dot denotes an individual property parcel that was reserved exclusively for white people. All this blue illuminates the 24,000 property parcels we have identified that have racial covenants. Looking at this close-up of a neighborhood in South Minneapolis, you can see each individual restricted property. No one has ever created a comprehensive map of this kind before for any American city. And as we have built it, in collaboration with the community, we have discovered it to be a powerful platform for policymaking, for research, and for community conversations. So what you see here is the spread of racial covenants throughout Hennepin County over time. This is where I like to say that we kind of borrow from the paradigm of epidemiological mapping. So as the covenants spread like a disease across the county, we found that people find this map particularly impactful if they are unfamiliar with this history. Most people in Minneapolis watch it, kind of waiting for the covenants to spread to their neighborhood, are not sure if they're going to get there. You know, so the text that I read you shows how these covenants were explicitly racist, and this map shows you how widespread they were. But I also want you to understand how powerful they were. To fully grasp this, you have to know how they were enforced. So these racial covenants were backed by the full power of the American judicial system. Covenants ran with the land, which meant that they could be enforced through the court system decades after they were embedded into the deeds. Anyone who breached a covenant, even after the property had changed hands several times, risked ending up in court. Anyone who sold covenanted land to a person who was not white risked losing that property altogether. This was a violation of the original property contract. And the person who breached the covenant would lose everything. It could trigger a process that would put the property back in the hands of the person who wrote the covenant. If that person was no longer alive, the property would revert to their heirs. So how are we doing this? In brief, for the period of 1910 to 1960, which is the time period where we have found covenants appear in Hennepin County, we have over 3 million pages of deed images encompassing over 1 million individual property deeds. As it says there, at 40 hours a week would have taken someone 20 years to read all of those. But by running optical character recognition, running all these through optical character recognition, that gave us a set, as we looked for certain racial terms, that gave us a set of about 177,000 images from 38,000 property deeds. So then after the computer flags the deeds it thinks contain racist language, we upload these documents to a crowdsourcing platform called Zooniverse. And then we put out a call to community members, asking them to read the historical property deeds and to extract the information we need to put these restrictions on a map. Since volunteers are manually transcribing information from historical documents, we needed help in verifying the data. So here we were assisted by a local group of altruistic computer coders who helped us develop a reliability score for our volunteers and a testing algorithm. And the actual map of the covenants is a combination of geographic information systems work and old-fashioned map library detective work. If the property parcel still exists as it did when the covenant was put in place, the data was joined easily. But if the parcel had been split or combined or is now part of a shopping center or a freeway, we needed to do some investigation to locate historical maps that could help us redraw those boundaries. So now that you've kind of seen the map and seen how we got there, I want to put some of this in context. One of the painful truths about the covenants is that most white people thought they were necessary. Black people, by contrast, saw covenants as a threat to basic liberty. Here in the Twin Cities, leaders like Nellie Francis and Marvel Jackson and Lena Olive Smith and Katie McWatt devoted their lives to fighting these practices. And all over the country, Black people put everything on the line to challenge them. They bought houses with covenants. They even moved into white neighborhoods. This is what Arthur and Edith Lee did in South Minneapolis in 1931 when they bought a tiny white bungalow. After they moved into the home with their young daughter, they found themselves under attack. The neighbors threatened and pleaded with them to leave, but they refused. Then the neighbors marched and organized a mob. According to one person, almost 6,000 white people showed up to terrorize the family. They shot out the windows, threw paint at the house, and even threatened to burn it down. This photo shows Mary with her mother in front of the new house after one of these attacks. Now, the house still stands at 46th and Columbus in South Minneapolis. You can see it today because Arthur was able to draw on other veterans and coworkers from the downtown post office where he worked. He had served our country in World War I, and these friends of his formed an armed perimeter and kept the house from being burned. But they couldn't protect the family from violence. The Lees had to retreat into their basement each night for safety. Mary had a police escort to get to kindergarten. Someone killed her dog. Arthur was arrested several times after threatening the vandals. Now, the Lee home did not have a covenant, but the proliferation of covenants nearby normalized the ideas that led to this attack. According to the logic of the covenants, the Lees posed a threat to the neighborhood. It's also important to remember that the Great Depression had already settled over the city, throwing over a third of the population out of work. So as these racial boundaries hardened in American cities, this threat of white violence was ever present. This was one of the main ways the covenants were enforced. Folks did not bother going to court. They would just call together a mob. There were many families like the Lees who worked with the NAACP, which gave them critical assistance and support. And the NAACP also brought a series of court challenges that ended up at the United States Supreme Court in 1948. That body declared covenants to be unenforceable. A few years later, elected officials made covenants illegal. The Minnesota state legislature banned new covenants in 1953, but existing covenants were still legal in Minnesota until 1962, when we passed a fair housing law that barred housing discrimination on the basis of race. The federal government followed suit in 1968 when it passed the Fair Housing Act, which is widely remembered as one of the most important pieces of civil rights legislation. And this legislation provided the endpoint for many versions of this history. But ending the narrative here would be misleading, because we are still living with the legacies of these policies. To understand the deep wounds left by these practices, we need to grasp how covenants changed the urban landscape. For example, when the first covenant was introduced in 1910 in Minneapolis, there were only about 2,700 Black people living in the city. This is a map of census data from that year, and here's what it shows. The city wasn't particularly segregated. Black families were buying property all over and helping friends and family members do the same thing. In 1910, the neighborhood with the highest percentage of Black residents was one called Near North. That's that darker section in the middle of the map. But even that area was only about 15% Black. Black people lived along the shores of Lake Harriet, Lake Nokomis, along the Mississippi River, on the West River Parkway, which are now some of the wealthiest neighborhoods in the city. And this could have continued. Black people could have been allowed to spread out across a growing city. But white Minneapolis decided that racially integrated neighborhoods were dangerous. After the Minneapolis Journal called on the real estate board to contain what it described as a considerable Negro colony, that body adopted an ethics manual in 1913, which had been published by the National Association of Realtors. So this declared that it was unethical for a real estate agent to introduce into a neighborhood, quote, members of any race or nationality whose presence will clearly be detrimental to property values. So today we call that real estate steering. And as this practice was becoming institutionalized, developers were experimenting with racial covenants, which were meant to establish the racial character of a neighborhood. In the decades that followed, these legal instruments changed the racial geography of American cities. So this is what the shift looked like in Minneapolis. By mid-century, Black people have been pushed out of all but a few neighborhoods. Those residents down by Lake Harriet were all gone. The same story with Lake Nokomis. By 1940, there is not a single census district in Northeast Minneapolis that contains multiple Black families. And for the first time in the city's history, multiple census districts are predominantly Black. So by 1940, after the covenants had been in place for 30 years, race determined your place of residence in our city. And Black people were concentrated into a couple of small neighborhoods. So here's a key point about this. This was not a response to the Great Migration. Minneapolis was not an endpoint for the Great Migration until well after World War II. In 1910, about 1% of the city was African American. By 1950, when the city's population peaked, it was still only 1.5%. So in other words, these new majority-minority neighborhoods were not the result of an influx of people of color who came to the city and wanted to settle near one another. And instead, people of color were being forced out of integrated parts of the city and were being concentrated into these pockets. And this story is in no way unique to Minneapolis. This urban reshuffling, this segregation by race, was happening in every community in the country. So across the nation, Black people, in the words of the poet Langston Hughes, were hemmed in. That's the title of a 1949 poem where he lamented his confinement in Chicago. They've got covenants restricting me, hemmed in on the south side, can't breathe free. 71 years later, Black people are still struggling to breathe in Minneapolis. Please, please, I can't breathe. That's what George Floyd pleaded as he lay pinned under the knee of a police officer. The death of Mr. Floyd grows out of a structural racism that is so entrenched in Minneapolis. Residential segregation is one of the manifestations of this structural racism. Segregation, once it was established, remains stubbornly entrenched. This map shows that the neighborhoods with covenants are still the whitest parts of the city today. The red on the map shows the location of covenants. You can see they're clustered on the sections that are white, which indicates concentrations of white people. These white neighborhoods haven't been seen as problematic. All of the attention has been directed at Black neighborhoods. And the policy solutions have not been terribly effective. As one scholar has declared, basically, whatever the problem is in the American city, the answer is to move the Black people. One way this is done is through freeway construction. In the 1950s, freeways were regarded as a critical to the growth of these new white suburbs. White commuters needed a way to drive from their restricted communities to their jobs downtown. They were also seen as engines of what was known as urban renewal. Their construction was used to clear neighborhoods that planners regarded as blighted. So this map shows our contemporary freeways overlaid on the demographic map from 1940. You can see the neighborhoods where people of color could live after the introduction of covenants, and you see the freeways. Across the country, freeways displaced millions of people and destroyed neighborhoods inhabited by people of color. In Minneapolis, near north was flattened, 7 corners were split in half, the old south side was walled off from the whiter neighborhoods to the west. These classified ads here were placed by Black families in Minneapolis who were desperate to find new homes after their houses were condemned by the Department of Transportation. So here's what our team has come to recognize about covenants. These restrictions did not just impose segregation. Covenants were used to keep people of color out of certain parts of the city altogether. Developers soon realized that covenants only worked if they kept everyone who was not white out. And the most effective way to do this was to incorporate these racial restrictions into a new neighborhood from the moment that they first emerged. So this is an aerial photograph of South Minneapolis that was taken in 1938. These red polygons here show land that was racially restricted before this photo was taken. So as you can see, the covenants are being embedded in the landscape before any other development takes place. They predate the roads, the houses, even sometimes the sewers. The first thing that the developers are thinking about is race. And this practice ensured that as American cities expanded, all new development was reserved for white people. Developers used them as marketing tools, printing racial restrictions directly in promotional material. This newspaper advertisement from 1913 stated that colored people were excluded from this new neighborhood in St. Paul, Minnesota. And the developer promised that restrictions will be enforced to the fullest extent of the law. Many people in neighborhoods like this one in South Minneapolis bought their homes just as the United States was about to see the largest expansion in the middle class in its history. Much of this prosperity would rest on homeownership, which had been deliberately supported by new federal programs in the 1930s. But these new programs introduced redlining as well as mortgage insurance. These discriminatory policies meant that 98% of FHA loans made between 1934 and 1962 went to white people. These programs were created to benefit white people. Like the GI Bill, they excluded people who were not white. 2 generations later, many white people are still benefiting from the fact that their parents and grandparents were encouraged to buy houses in parts of the city where property values climbed throughout the 20th century. In Minneapolis, our research shows that today, more than 50 years after the Fair Housing Act, Houses in Minneapolis that had covenants are worth 14% more than identical houses that did not have covenants. Many people were able to pass that additional value on to their descendants. A 2019 survey by the National Association of Realtors found that 30% of first-time homebuyers get help from family to manage the purchase of a home. In this way, people leverage the economic security of earlier generations to secure the future of their family. So these avenues for advancement were closed to people who were not white. Covenants worked with redlining. That was a federal policy that declared that often black neighborhoods to be too hazardous for federally underwritten loans. And so covenants worked with that to depress homeownership rates for black people. While they targeted anyone who was perceived to not be white using a definition that was capricious and ever shifting, the combined impact of covenants plus redlining was particularly devastating for black people who were shut out of property ownership. Today, in Minneapolis and St. Paul, we have the highest gap between black and white homeownership rates for any major metropolitan area in the country. 75% of white families own their homes. Only 23% of African American families can make that same claim. And property ownership is tied to citizenship in the United States. It's essential for wealth accumulation. You can draw a straight line from these historic restrictions on property ownership to the contemporary racial wealth gap. It's 10 to 1 today. For every dollar owned by the average white family in the United States, the average black family has less than 1 dime. So Mapping Prejudice as a project is designed to help people see structural racism. And when I say structural racism, I mean collective racial prejudice that is backed by legal authority and institutional control. Racial covenants are classic manifestations of structural racism. Racism is not just a matter of personal bias. It's not just the sentiments like these protesters who picketed the Minnesota state hearings on fair housing in 1962. Their placards make their bigotry plain. But Mapping Prejudice is helping people see and look beyond blatant racism to get people to see the structures. We want people to see how racist ideology has been embedded into community institutions over decades, that racism has been written into the foundational documents of our communities. So here on the left is a redlining map of Minneapolis from the late 1930s. In case you're not intimately familiar, to go a little more in depth here, redlining was a process where areas of a city were designated based on the perceived risk factors of giving out home loans in those areas. So green being the best areas to loan, red being the worst. And then on the right here is a map representing the redlined areas overlaid with the location of African American families in Minneapolis in 1940. So as you can see, the location of the redlined areas is highly correlated with the location of those African American families. And I also try to approach this topic not just as a librarian, but also as a geographer. In particular, I've had many conversations about our map and the idea of critical cartography, specifically the lens that maps reflect and perpetuate relations of power, typically in favor of a society's dominant group. For example, the redlining map. But what we're attempting to do with Mapping Prejudice could fall under the idea of countermapping, so trying to flip that power dynamic in favor of a less dominant group. Structural racism undergirds our community maps. It sorts people into zones of privilege, zones of dispossession. It means that even people who live next to each other have different trajectories. This history helps us understand why it seems to be the same group of people who are vulnerable to housing insecurity, which affected the health, educational opportunities, and job prospects of generations of Americans. So structural racism undergirds a system that was built to keep Black and brown people from owning property. It was designed to keep them from amassing wealth. It was designed to keep Black bodies out of places seen as desirable. It was designed to keep Black and brown bodies out of community spaces that were supposed to belong to all of us. So what about today? What do we do now? The time has come to make amends. Remembering is the first step toward justice, but then we need action. For example, we're able to build maps like these, showing how demographic patterns today are linked to the housing practices of the past. Here you can see that though the city average today is 53% white in Minneapolis, the areas that were covenanted are still 79% white. And these maps showing a direct connection, as I mentioned earlier, between material and generational wealth and racist historical housing policies. Homes with racial restrictions are worth 14% more than the median, while houses in redlined areas are worth 25% less. So Mapping Prejudice is making this intervention in the civic arena by inviting community members to help us build these maps. People listen to our presentation, they look at our map, and then they read the deeds. They engage directly with the primary source materials. We're asking our community researchers to document the deliberate campaign to create an all-white landscape. By engineering the encounters between people in the past, we're prompting participants to confront the origins of contemporary disparities. And in this way, we're building a foundation for the policy work that can make change in the future. So it's up to all of us to make sure that this awareness translates into action. We need to avoid the mistakes of the past. As Minneapolis City Council member Jeremiah Ellison recently warned, during every crisis, well-meaning white people make a ritual of acknowledging the city's steep inequities. It's as if people think the mere acknowledgement is the work. And the work is more than this. But to figure out what we need to change, we need to listen to people that are most affected. For example, locally here, one place we start is this policy agenda developed by the Alliance, which is a coalition of housing and growth organizations led by people of color. And the solutions will cost money. We need to invest in housing, in schools, in neighborhoods, in people, because we have to consider the alternative. So in our project, we often repeat the refrain that we are not policymakers. We're helping people to see why this reparative work is urgent. In essence, we are making a case for reparations. And we have to remember that this reparative work also goes beyond money. It demands moral capital. Reparations, in the words of Ta-Nehisi Coates, is the full acceptance of our collective biography and its consequences. He writes that it is more than recompense for past injustices, more than a handout, a payoff, hush money, or a reluctant bribe. Reparations, in the words of Coates, is a national reckoning that would lead to spiritual renewal. So I want to conclude with just some information about the project and some numbers. As I mentioned, we reviewed over 1 million deeds, 3 million images using optical character recognition, flagged 177,000 images, 38,000 property deeds. We had over 3,000 volunteers who did over 120,000 classifications and transcriptions of these deeds. We did over 200 public presentations in the past 4 years. We've identified about 24,000 racial covenants in Hennepin County. And we've leveraged this data. We've put it out there. It informed the development of the Minneapolis 2040 plan, which is our community planning and economic development department of the city, their plan for the next 20 years. It helped effect a zoning change in Minneapolis, the first of its kind in the country. Inspired bipartisan legislation that permitted homeowners to repudiate the racial covenants in their deeds. And our project is expanding to St. Paul next door here in Ramsey County. And here's just a picture from the Minnesota Governor Tim Walz signing our covenants, the bill related to the covenants in June of 2019. You can learn more at mappingprejudice.umn.edu. I do also want to acknowledge the 3 other project co-founders. Without their combined expertise, our project would never have come together. I'm just one member of this team, and my role is mostly administration and project management. So I do kind of the budgets and the HR stuff and the university bureaucracy navigation and strategic planning. The actual kind of on-the-ground team includes Kirsten Delegard, who's our project director, the person who had this idea in the first place, Penny Peterson, who's a historical property researcher. So without her looking up 4,000 covenants manually, this project never would have gotten off the ground or gotten any funding. And then Kevin Erman Solberg, who's our geographic information systems and technical lead. Without his creativity and workflows, we'd have no deeds to transcribe and no transcriptions to map. So the 4 of us together and all of our combined talents are what we're able to get this project up and off the ground. And with that, I'm happy to take some questions. So I do have these, a PDF of these slides available there. I'll leave that up on the screen for a few minutes.
That's great, Ryan. There's a few questions in the chat. If you could just repeat the year range of where the years that the deeds are from. And then just to be clear, that these were not landlord-tenant relationships. These were the property deeds. These were covenants written into the transfer of property documents.
Yes. So in Minneapolis and Hennepin County, we found deeds between 1910 was the earliest one, and I think 1955 or so. When we look at new counties in the Midwest anyway, we ask for deeds between 1900 and 1968, just to kind of buffer a little bit on each end. And yes, these are deeds. These are property deeds. These are homeowners. So these restrictions went into the property record when, if it was Ryan Mattke's farm and I had 40 acres and I wanted to split it up into lots and sell it off, and it became, Mattke's first addition to Minneapolis. When I created the lots, I would put this restriction in there. And that's where I talk about the power of it, is that if I sell that to you and you sell that to someone else and they sell that to someone else and they sell that to a black person in 40 years,
exactly.
The covenants are legal, I get the property back and the person who sold it loses all of their equity.
Yeah, talking about enforced by the power of law.
Yes, so it actually goes to the next question of the covenants in perpetuity. They are, and they ran with the land. So technically, if you had a covenant that was on the land, they're by legal description of the property parcel. So instead of being, your address, it would be, Mattke's first edition of Minneapolis, block 17, lot 22. Now, theoretically, if covenants were still enforceable, if you built an apartment building on there, that covenant would still be in place for that land. They are in perpetuity. They are still in the property record. Property records are inordinately hard to change for many good reasons in the U.S. They are made illegal and unenforceable. They were made unenforceable by Supreme Court decision, Shelley v. Kramer in 1948. They were made illegal by the Fair Housing Act. But if the Fair Housing Act ever gets repealed, technically covenants would still be enforced, or could be enforced, or could be at least argued for. So that goes to Tom's question there. The covenants have not been voided. The covenants are still in the property record. Yeah, they're still there.
Ryan, we've posted your slides link in the chat.
Great.
As
Fantastic.
well as a link to the Mapping Prejudice website if people want more information.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, the covenants have not been voided simply because property record is still, that's just how property works. The latest year we found a covenant in Hennepin County, I think is 1955, which is interesting because that's after they were, well, they said, it was after they said no new covenants in 1953 in Minnesota. And so it would depend, there have been covenants, I know, research around the country. There have been covenants found, I think, in Massachusetts in the 1800s. San Francisco, I know, had anti-Chinese covenants starting in the 1880s, 1890s. Yeah. Have we looked at inequities in educational funding? That has been, we haven't looked directly. This actually goes, there's always a question, which leads me to a point I want to make, which is that it's always the same map. And we get that comment over and over. When we show someone a map of the covenants in Minneapolis, they can say, from my area of interest, that's the same map or that's the inverse map. So the covenants, we can't necessarily say that the covenants caused educational disparities, but areas that had covenants ended up with more investment over the last 100 years, more investment in education, more investment in, there's like the tree cover map often corresponds to these things, because there's more infrastructure investment. There was just more money put into, more funding put into certain areas and funding left out of other areas that didn't have covenants or that were redlined.
This has been found for Los Angeles too, about the tree cover. And then one specific local example, the city of Inglewood, the South Central LA suburb was founded as a whites only city. And I don't know what happened to those deeds, but it was by municipal law.
Yep. And we've actually, as a side note, we did get a National Endowment for the Humanities grant this year, and that is to actually expand or to all of our methodological approaches to this, be they Python computer scripts or, the OCR or the GIS approaches are all necessarily hard-coded for Hennepin County, because that's how we kind of figured out how to do all of this. The grant from NEH is to make those methodologies more flexible and adaptable to other places. And actually one of the places we named in the grant to test their deeds is Orange County. and because we've been in contact with people in Santa Ana, and they've been interested in mapping covenants in Orange County.
And then there's a question almost at the end about LA, which you just mentioned, and I did want to mention the same person, Dan Sconlin, asked about the similar work being done in other cities with the redlining maps. Most of those Hulk redlining maps, did you do those as well, or was that someone else?
No, that's the University of Richmond, mapping inequality. So mapping prejudice, mapping inequality, similar names. And they've been going for about 10 years, so that our projects are somewhat similar in structure, although the benefit they had is that everything they needed to look at was in the National Archives, as opposed to in the property deeds held at every county recorder's office across the country. So yes, the redlining maps are available. It's a mapping inequality, University of Richmond. You can get the maps, you can get the original map. They now have posted a georeference version of every map they have, and polygons, shapefiles for all of that, which also includes the textual descriptions of why an area got a certain rating, which can be quite illuminating as well. Yeah, and so I'm just scanning to see, have you looked at what portion of all properties have you researched? So in Hennepin County, we have theoretically had OCR look at every deed that was recorded between 1910 and 1960. So we're not saying we've caught every covenant because we haven't had human eyes on it and it was machine readable stuff. But we're pretty confident that we've hit all the areas that have covenants. And we're moving on to Ramsey County, which is St. Paul next door. Yeah, we love to use GIS to illustrate these sorts of things. I love getting away from, I love GIS. I have a master's in GIS, but I love getting away from just the classic GIS mapping and using it for public policy, that sort of thing. And yeah, the impact on the urban plan. So that I mentioned that they actually did the big change they made. One of the first places in the country to do this is everywhere that was single family home residential zoning is now any lot in the city that was residential single family is now rezoned for up to a triplex. So you could tear down a house and put up a 3-unit something on that property.
And Ryan, would you like to end with more future work? So Tom Paper also asked, can you elaborate on the work in front of you? Specifically, are there additional documents to review and additional maps to be made?
Yeah, so the future work we're doing is really kind of pushing this into other cities and trying to make comparisons. So we're even finding differences in how St. Paul is doing things, how Ramsey County did it. And we just signed an MOU with Anoka County, which is just adjacent to both of those, just to the north here, to do another one. With the NEH grant, we're reaching out across the country. So Milwaukee County is probably one where we're going next. As I mentioned, Orange County. So the work going forward, I think, and a lot of this presentation is about the stories of how it affected people. And I think that is also extremely important. And so we want to both map these things, have that granular data, like the Federal Reserve in Minneapolis has been loving having the individual property record data for like where these racial restrictions were as they run numbers on things. So doing this for more places across the country. And yeah, someone else had just a question about sharing the slides are free to share with anyone. And we actually have on our website, there's both an educational guide, if you're talking about using it, especially if someone's mentioned K-12. There's an educator's guide that we developed actually at the beginning of the pandemic because so many teachers were going online and how could they use our stuff. And there's also on one of the links, I think under resources, there's a reckoning with racism, like what do I do next? There's some steps of things to see. There's an hour-long documentary called Jim Crow of the North that's based on our work. Yeah, so there's a lot of resources on our website.
That's great. Well, thank you so much, Ryan, for taking time out of your weekend to spend it with us. I'm seeing a lot of applause on the video right now. Chats are coming in. And like Ryan said, there's a number of other projects like this going on around the country. There's lots and lots of work left to do, both with primary documents and out in the streets, I think. We're scheduled to break.
John, this is Ron. Could I make an announcement? On a related topic to Ryan's wonderful presentation, this week, Chris Lane gave a lecture through the Washington Map Society and the other North American Map Societies. And Chris's topic was Prejudice and the Opening of the American West. So I've been in touch with Chris. We should get a copy of that, and we should be able to get access to that for the members of the California Map Society. So that actually goes up to about the beginning of the 20th century. So it'd be a wonderful partner presentation for Ryan's.
Another good partner presentation is the joint meeting with the Chicago Map Society in December. We're going to talk about red line maps in Chicago.
This December.
This December.
Great. Great. Well, we're scheduled to be on a break until 12:30. Please feel free to share and chat. I'm going to turn off my camera and stretch my legs a little bit, and we'll reconvene at 12:30.